If your novel does not do these 4 things within its opening, then there's a good chance that readers won't like it. What information and the order that it's revealed is incredibly important in the opening of your novel. If you think about it, when the reader sits down to start reading your novel, they don't know anything about it. The challenge of the opening is getting this information across succinctly in a way that engages and doesn't confuse the reader. I've set this idea up as a funnel because if you think about it, you're basically taking all the possibilities of what your novel could be about and you're funneling them down into exactly what the story is actually about. There's 4 parts to the funnel and also a 5th part that we'll talk about later on. The order doesn't matter a ton. I went back and forth on it a bunch, but what matters is that you accomplish these 4 things within the opening scene of your novel. All right, so let's start at the top of the funnel with what I'm calling the sensory information. This is basically where and when your story is happening, what environment it's happening in. Are we in Las Vegas? Are we on the top of a mountain? Are we in a submarine? Are we in the jungle? This information is important because not knowing where a scene is taking place, especially the first scene of a novel, not knowing this can be quite jarring to the reader. It's weird to get like 500 or 1,000 words into a novel and then find out, oh, by the way, this is actually happening on a boat. Also, describing the environment is one of the first opportunities you have for concrete description, which is one of the first times within the novel where you can get some emotional engagement out of the reader. Now, revealing the environment and the sensory information does not require giving a ton of detail about the setting that the scene is taking place in. You can say something like waves crashing across the bow, and that will immediately imply that we're on a ship at sea in rough waters. That's probably enough information about the environment, about the sensory environment for your opening to ground the reader. So as an example of this, in the novel that I'm currently working on, the opening scene, there's a girl sitting on a hill in the desert and she's part of this like tribe of herding people and she's kind of sitting on this hill looking out over the tribe. I basically describe all of this sensory information in like 1 or 2 sentences. I describe the hill, I mention the sand, and I say something about it being late afternoon and it being hot and in the desert. That's really all the information that you need in order to ground the reader into what environment the scene is taking place in. The important thing about this and the important thing about everything in this funnel is to focus on important details. What about the environment matters the most? Does it matter that we're in a back alley somewhere, or does it matter that we're in Chicago? Also remember that you're going to reveal more information as you move through that first scene and as you move through the entire novel. So you don't have to reveal everything about the environment right out of the gate. The second part of the funnel is activity. This is closely related to the sensory environment, but it's basically what's happening in the scene. What's the general vibe? What's going on? Is there a fist fight breaking out? Are 2 people having a pleasant conversation? Is a character alone walking through the woods? Are there artillery shells landing all around them? This is important because it frames the emotional tone of your opening, and it allows you to do things like imply that the reader should be confused because there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. Activity is also important because this is the first step that you're taking into the story as far as plot goes, because just describing an environment does not make a story. So as an example, in the opening of the novel that I'm currently working on, basically this herding tribe, through the course of this particular day, a bunch of the animals have been randomly dropping dead for reasons that nobody can quite understand. So there's a lot of confusion and kind of chaos, and anxiety and this kind of sense of foreboding through the opening of the story. That's kind of the activity that I'm describing in my opening. It's people running around, confusion, a bunch of dead things everywhere. Just like with the sensory environment, when it comes to activity, you want to focus on important details. You don't need to describe every single thing that every single character is doing in the scene. You just need to focus on a few important details to ground the reader so they can get an understanding of what's happening in the scene. Next up, the third part of the funnel is character. I really went back and forth on whether this should be the first part of the funnel or whether it should be further down. But ultimately, I put environment and activity above character because they're usually easier to introduce. And from a visual and understanding the scene perspective, they're arguably more important, I would say. The character part of the funnel represents the first information revealed about who a character in the scene is. We might get a name before this, we might get an action that they're doing before this, but this is the first bit of actual characterization that the reader sees. So this could be something like if your story happens in the 1920s in a loud, jazzy speakeasy with a bunch of people milling about and the band playing super loud, but then you have a character who's sitting alone at the bar nursing a drink or something. That's the first thing that's kind of revealed about the character. This does not mean a long physical description of the character or relating the entire backstory of the character, just a few, one or two relevant details that start the reader towards understanding who that character is. You'll notice a theme with a lot of these in that it's just one or two details that we're getting across about these different areas. It's not all of the information because, again, we're talking about the first 500,000 words of a story, so we don't have a ton of room to go into a lot of detail. So in the novel that I'm working on, the first thing that we learn about the character is that she actually knows why all of the animals are dying and nobody else knows, but she knows, and she's not telling anybody about it. That's kind of the first thing that we learn, the first insight that we get into the character who's taking part in the scene. So the last part of the funnel, the fourth part, is what I'm calling context. I put this one last because it's probably the thing that should be revealed the least in your opening, and revealing too much of it could actually be a problem. When you start out with your opening scene, the reader will see events happening, they'll see things about the character, they'll see things about the environment, but they don't know the broader importance or the context of these events. They don't know why these events are important or the broader situation that they're happening in. So your story might start out on a ship that's crossing the Atlantic Ocean in a big storm. The broader context of that scene is that it's a destroyer escorting a supply convoy because the Germans are at it again out there with their U-boats and whatever. That's the broader context of a sensory environment and an activity that we've described in the scene. You want to describe a little bit of context within your opening, but you definitely don't want to go overboard with it. If anything, you should err on the side of sharing less context. Sharing too much context is really when you start to get into info dump territory. So the kind of archetypical fantasy world building info dump where we get all of the information about the setting and all these events that have happened up to the start of the story, that's all context, and too much of that can ruin your opening. Good fiction is about questions, not answers. The right amount of context creates questions that the reader wants answered. Too much context gives too many answers and doesn't make the reader want to continue reading. I think a lot of people get this backwards where they feel like they need to provide the reader all of this context so that they understand everything about the story before they get into actually reading the story, when that's actually backwards. The point of the story, in large part, is to deliver the context around the events. The reader learns about context. You answer these questions as you go through the story. So just to continue talking about my own novel here, because I've done that for every other part of the funnel, the context that I kind of reveal in my opening is that this sort of thing with the character has happened before. There's been several events through her life where these sorts of things have happened, and that's basically all the context that's revealed, is that this is not the first time that this sort of event has taken place in this character's life. The last part I mentioned there was kind of a fifth component in addition to these four, and I didn't leave myself room to put it up here, but it's basically having something that's compelling. Is compelling spelled with two L's? So I put this up top because it's kind of a separate thing here, and really what it comes down to is you want to have something compelling within your introduction. You want to have something that will hook the reader, something that will get their attention, something that will make them want to keep reading. And your compelling element could be any one of these four things. It could be something in the environment, it could be something about the activity that's happening, it could be something about the character, could be something about the context. But you really want to think about in your introduction, what am I sharing that is compelling? What's going to pique the reader's interest? An example of this, 1984 by George Orwell, the opening line of that novel is, "It was a bright cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13. That's kind of an interesting, compelling thing. It goes against kind of the way we would normally think about clocks because most clocks don't have a 13 on them. So that's a compelling introduction, and it's right at the opening, so it's right at the top of the funnel in that book because it's the first line. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is this idea of pre-funneling. So this idea that the reader is going to go into your story already knowing some of this information. So this could be because they've watched a review of the book or read a review of the book. It could be because they know the genre of the book, and the genre itself also works to kind of funnel things down. Or they might have read the blurb or just have general knowledge about your book. A famous work like 1984, I would imagine 90% of people have a vague idea of what that book is about because it's such a famous work and it's talked about a lot. One place where I noticed pre-funneling the first time is when I first went on critique sites. So not doing like paid critique, but going on the critique sites where you can share your work with other people. I found it really surprising how weird it was to start reading a novel that I knew absolutely nothing about. Because you just go on that site, you pick somebody's novel and you kind of start reading it. I hadn't realized how when I would just read a novel, how often I was going into that novel already knowing some things, already having some understanding of this funnel, because I either would see reviews about the book, or I would just know about it because it was a very famous novel, or I would have read the blurb or something like that. So what are the takeaways from this? I think the main one is to make sure that your opening is doing these 4 or 5 things. And if it's not within, if you get like 1,000 words into your novel and you haven't described the environment at all, that could be a bit of a problem. Think about what crucial information of these 4 categories you want to share and why you're sharing that information and why it's helpful to your opening to share that information. And also try to think about this from the reader's perspective. Starting a new novel is very uncomfortable. You don't know what's going on. You don't know any of the characters. It can be very jarring, very uncomfortable. So easing them through this with a good funnel, with revealing all of these 4 areas, can be very helpful. Just like I hope this video was helpful. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.